Welcome to the Crossing Church. We're so glad you're here. We are continuing on in our series, Road to the Cross. It's been a great series so far. Pastor Brian took us through Peter's denial and Judas's betrayal last week. Next week, we're actually going to take a step back in the timeline and talk about Palm Sunday and Jesus' triumphal entry. It's also a great week to invite your friends because our worship choir is presenting their Easter production as well next weekend, so it is going to be a ton of fun. We hope you'll be there. They sound phenomenal. You don't want to miss it. But this week, I get to look at the trial of Jesus before Pilate. Pontius Pilate is kind of an interesting figure in church history, maybe a little more central to it than most of us even realize, and the only person outside of the Holy Trinity mentioned in the Apostles' Creed. There's that line, suffered under Pontius Pilate. He was kind of a lifelong politician, probably started in the Roman army and worked his way up to the post he had over Judea, where he was essentially a junior governor. All right, so he probably had political aspirations to continue to move up the chain and hopefully one day be in Rome with the big guys. But for now, he was tasked to oversee this region for a couple reasons. One of the most important reasons that they had to keep him in this Judea region in check was there was a corn trade from Egypt that ran right through it. And it was very important because it was about the only way that the Roman city could feed all of the people that were there. And so Pilate was tasked to kind of keep the peace, to kind of rule, do whatever he had to keep this corn trade coming through to Rome. He was known to be an insecure man. We have a lot of history books written about him. There was an early historian named Josephus that wrote a lot about some of our early church history and Pilate and some of those other characters. He was insecure. He wasn't the most confident, and because of that, he made up for his ruling style with brute force. He was known to kind of get his way by the sword and doing whatever he had to do to make sure that no one challenged his power. And in that, it could be said that he was rather insensitive to the Jews that were gathered in that time. When he came in, he established a bunch of Roman things over top of their Jewish religion. He brought in coins with Caesar's face on it, said Caesar is Lord. He put statues up through Rome to remind them of who was in charge, and kind of did not care at all about their religion. As long as they played ball and stayed out of his way, it was fine to do that. But where we find ourselves in this particular story is right at the precipice of Passover. This festival where it's estimated over 1 million Jews had pilgrimaged into this area to celebrate Passover together. And so Pilate is now tasked with this large group of people, way more than normal in this area, and there's kind of a stirring bubbling up underneath with these people. And so he has to make sure that he keeps the lid on the pot and it doesn't boil over, that he keeps any sort of rebellion or any sort of skirmish from turning into something that could get him in trouble with Rome, that could get him removed from his post or worse, killed. So as insecure as he is and making up for it with power and strength, he's making sure that he continues his trajectory. Whatever happens has to continue to enhance his power and his rule and his reign as he goes forward. And so when we pick up in John 18, what we see here in verse 28, then they took Jesus from Caiaphas to Pilate's headquarters. The they that we're talking about there, this is the Jewish high priests. There's a group called the Sanhedrin. There's 71 priests that kind of make up the ruling council of this Jewish religion. And they're taking him from Caiaphas, the high priest's headquarters, to Pilate's. They've decided that this Jesus needs to be removed, and this is their plan. It was early in the morning. They themselves did not enter the headquarters so as to avoid ritual defilement and to be able to eat at the Passover. So Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" And they answered, "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." And Pilate said to them, "Then take him yourselves and judge him according to your law." The Jews replied, "We are not permitted to put anyone to death." So what we find here in this particular section of text is that this Jewish religious establishment has already decided they have to figure out a way to kill Jesus. But under the Roman rule of law that they live under, they are not permitted to execute capital punishment. The only way they might be able to execute capital punishment is if a Gentile defiled the temple, which is not what has happened here. And so they're trying to devise a plan to kill Jesus, but do it in a way where they don't get in trouble from the Romans and they don't get punished or even kill themselves because of how they went to do this. And so Pilate is faced with this decision, and we see what he says. He goes, he's broken no Roman laws. Why do you want me to kill him? And being insecure and being scared of losing his power, he's trying to navigate this situation because he's vulnerable. If this situation goes sideways, Rome could find out, and he could lose his job, or worse, his life. He's got a patron in Rome, Sejanus, I believe was his name, that basically the only reason he got posted here in Judea, somebody is at the right hand of the emperor speaking highly of Pontius Pilate and saying he's the one. And so as long as that man's there, hopefully Pilate still has his position. So what the Jewish high priest decided to do is they flipped the language a little bit. Instead of saying, we bring you a criminal, they change and say, no, he's not a criminal. This man claims to be a king. And instantly what Pilate hears when people are claiming to be kings or gods or something, now that is a power move. That is a threat to my way of life. That is a threat to Rome, and that threat must be squashed. So we pick up in the next verse, in verse 33. Then Pilate entered the headquarters again, summoned Jesus himself, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you ask this on your own, or did others tell you about me?" And Pilate replied, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and chief priests have handed you over to me. What have you done?" And Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not from this world. If my kingdom were from this world, my followers would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not from here." So Pilate asked him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say that I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." And Pilate asked him, "What is truth?" After he said this, he went out to the Jews again and told them, "I find no case against him." What we find a lot through the Gospels and encountering with Jesus is he does this thing. It's a Socratic way of responding. When he's asked a question, he always responds, or almost always responds, with another question. Right? I think we all know that guy too, and it's the most annoying thing in the world. It's like, just answer my question. We don't need to pontificate on the health benefits of Chipotle versus Chick-fil-A. I just said, where do you want to go for lunch? Sorry, that's a personal thing that happens. But Jesus answers a question with a question. All right, and he talks continually about this idea of a kingdom. The high priest accused him of saying he was a king. Pilate asked him, "Are you a king?" And he doesn't answer, but he does say, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it was of this world, my followers would come and fight for me." We hear this time and time again in the words of Jesus, that there is a kingdom breaking through into this world that is not one that is done by force. Over and over, we hear Jesus talk about this idea that there's a kingdom that comes through the idea of loving the unlovable. That there's this idea of sword is not the way to take over, but maybe love is. We pray for those that persecute us and pray for our enemies. And then Pilate asks another question, and then, just like every second-year philosophy major in college, like, well, what is truth, really? We all know that guy. He hasn't showered in 2 weeks, shows up to class late. What is truth? Pilate is staring at truth as he asks the question. But the idea that we find here, and a lot of us, when we read Scripture, when we read these things, we can't help but read it with 21st century eyes, right? Like, this is our context. This is how we understand things. But in the context in which it was written, and to whom it was written, there's something else bubbling up underneath in this language between Pilate and Jesus. There's this idea in the Greco-Roman world, it wasn't uncommon to have kind of wandering philosophers roam about, even claim that they're God, but were never seen as a threat because they're kind of like that second-year philosophy student that hasn't showered in 2 weeks. They're just kind of strange and out there and spouting off things. And so all of a sudden we see this shift in Pilate's thinking. Maybe he's just a wandering philosopher. There is no threat here. And he comes out to the high priests and says, I find nothing wrong. I find no guilt. He's innocent in my eyes. But that's not enough for the Jewish religious establishment that pushed Jesus into Pilate's lap and asked for him to be killed. And so Pilate goes on and does something that was also common, and it would be done to wandering philosophers. There's this idea that they could just kind of give a warning beating, a warning scourge, kind of a way to help people remember who's in charge to tamp out rebellions before they can even begin. And so they take Jesus, and they whip him, and they beat him. And there's two different ideas that we find in Scripture. The Jews had strict laws on how many times you could beat somebody. And the Romans, you could beat them until the soldier was tired. So until he was tired of whipping that person, he could just keep on going. And they placed this crown of thorns upon Jesus' head and wrap him in a purple robe, which we see, again, in our 21st century eyes, it seems very regal, and the vestment, and it's liturgical, and there's a reason and a purpose for this. But in the ancient Near East, this was actually just a way to make fun of somebody. Like, this was used in comedic plays and ways to embarrass a person. And so Pilate has Jesus beaten and whipped, kind of like a warning of like, okay, I've beat him and whipped him. He's bloody. We're making fun of him. Are you sure this is the man? He didn't even fight back. We pick up in John 19. Pilate went out again and said to them, look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no case against him. This is the first time he says that again. So Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, here is the man. When the chief priests and the police saw him, they shouted, crucify him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, take him yourselves and crucify him. I find no case against him. The Jews answered him, we have a law, and according to that law, he ought to die because he has claimed to be the Son of God. And that's intentional language again. What Caiaphas and the high priest are saying, he's claiming to be the Son of God, because Son of God was another name for Caesar. And so they're trying to set up any way possible to get rid of this guy Jesus that is threatening their way of life. But 3 times, Pilate says, I find no guilt. Pilate's left in kind of this predicament because he is insecure as a person, and he's potentially weak. If this riot gets out of hand, Rome could have him killed or at least removed from his post. And so Pilate gives way to the crowd and hands Jesus over, and he's crucified. Pilate himself was recalled from office a few years later. Actually, he was recalled for his aggressive and inhumane treatment of the Jewish people. This is Pontius Pilate. Caiaphas was the chief priest of the time. His power base was this group called the Sanhedrin. It was a group of 71 Jews, mostly high priests, that he presided over. And yes, it was tough work, but it seemed very, very rewarding because modern archaeologists have discovered that they lived very well. The lap of luxury, big houses for the time, whatever luxury was for that time, Caiaphas indulged in it and enjoyed it. He was very influential and very powerful. He was the one that you wanted to know in town. He had the best political connections. He could get you into any restaurant, even if there was a wait. I don't know if that was true. But he was the guy. And what's interesting about Caiaphas is he didn't come to this high priest role in the normal way. You see, Caiaphas was appointed by the Roman government. The governor before Pontius Pilate selected Caiaphas and placed him in power in charge of this Jewish council of high priests because he knew that they could get what they want. They could keep the Judean area under control as long as Caiaphas played ball. They hand-selected the person they wanted to be in charge of this Jewish religion of the time. But the only way that Caiaphas had any power was because Rome allowed it. At the end of the day, if Pilate said the word, Caiaphas was gone. But Caiaphas did well enough. He was already high priest for about 16 years at this point, when the average high priest of the time lasted only 4 years. But the problem arises when this man named Jesus comes onto the scene and essentially threatens Caiaphas's way of life. He's not following the rules quite right. He seems to be doing things differently. He's inhibiting our ability to make money the way we were before. He's even telling us that the money we make, we should give away. This man is hanging out with prostitutes and tax collectors and touching unclean lepers. This man is gaining a following. They are leaving us and our teachings and following him, and that can't happen. One of the miracles Jesus performed in the book of John, in the Gospel of John, is he raised Lazarus from the dead. And Jesus has gone around and performed many miracles and done different things and ministered in different ways, but when he raised Lazarus from the dead, the high priests and the council had enough. We pick this up in John 11. So the chief priests and the Pharisees called a meeting of the council and said, "What are we to do? This man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and the Romans will come and destroy both our holy place and our nation." So Caiaphas and the high priests are terrified of losing what they hold so dear in their life, and this man named Jesus, who's turning everything upside down, is the one they think is solely responsible. See, another story that we find with Jesus is he goes into the temple at one point. It's actually in 2 different Gospels, and he gets angry at what he sees going on, and he flips over tables and drives the money changers out with a whip. What I actually never noticed reading that story, at least in one of the accounts, is he goes in, he's angered by what happens, and he braids a leather whip. I don't know the last time you sat down and braided a leather whip, but it was not instantaneous. He had time to think about this and what was going on and why what was happening in this temple was so terrible, and then drove them out. You see, he didn't drive them out because they were just selling things in the temple to make a profit. It's specifically what they were selling that upset Jesus enough to flip over the tables and drive them out. They were essentially selling as pure as you can make animals, ready for sacrifice, skirting all of the Jewish purity laws and what you have to go through to correctly perform a ritual, and they were making bank by doing this. They were essentially selling indulgences for my Catholic friends that are joining us today. It's an easy way. It's an easy get-out-of-jail-free card. It's an easy way to skirt most of your responsibilities to still do just enough to be seen as good in the eyes of God. And Jesus flipped the tables and drove them out. But what this did to Caiaphas and his high priest is it went right to his bottom line, and the money that they were making hand over fist from that money stream dried up. Jesus is challenging their way of life. And not just what they teach in their religion, but how good they have it. All the political influence that they have is slowly starting to dissipate as people are flocking to this man named Jesus who's teaching things that just sound so absurd to a rich, wealthy high priest. So when they come to Pilate, they know something has to be done. And so they're trying to be evasive. They're trying to use language to convince Pilate that this man has to die. Caiaphas is no dummy. He knows what's going on, and he's doing everything he can to twist it just enough to get Pilate on his side. I've got now a 4-year-old daughter. In fact, her birthday party is in the gym after this service, and if we were preaching on hell today, that would be a good example for me to use of 30 or 40 kids running around and screaming, and dad just standing there like, I'm okay. But at 4, she already knows how to twist words and twists ideas to get us on her side. Camden, Avery's crying. Did you hit him? No, Daddy. Why is he crying? Well, I pushed him. Do you understand that those are basically the same thing? No, Daddy. One is hitting and one is pushing. Go to your room. Even at 4, we understand how to twist words to get people on our side, and that's exactly what Caiaphas and the high priest were doing because they had to get Pilate on their side because they needed rid of this man, Jesus, that threatened their way of life. We read this earlier, but just as a reminder, in John 18, when they bring him, this is what we find. So Pilate went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" And they answered, "If this man were not a criminal, we would not have handed him over to you." Almost no charge at all. They're just basically saying he's a criminal, do something. Then they change their language to say, well, he's a king. He's claiming to be a king. He's claiming to be an insurrectionist. He's going to lead a rebellion. He's claiming to be God and more powerful than Caesar. Whatever they had to say to get Pilate on their side, Caiaphas did. But the other side of this, even though Caiaphas is in good with the Roman government and they take care of each other, there is still a sense in this Jewish religion where they daily pray for the Messiah. Even though they have it good, they're not truly the ones in power, and they're still occupied by this Roman Empire, and they pray daily for this conquering king, this coming Messiah that will come and raise them back to power. They will push off all of these false gods from the Roman Empire and others that have invaded at the time and place their one true God as the real God. That will give them the power, the politics, everything they want. They will have it all. They are waiting for this Messiah. And as we learned a few weeks ago, Jesus made that claim that he was the one, that he was the Messiah. And as they expected a conquering king to come in and wipe out Rome with power, with force, and with might, this is a God that took off his robe, tied a towel around his waist, and bent down and washed feet, and took on the lowest role in society and said things like, "Blessed are the meek, and blessed are the poor." And he hung out with prostitutes and tax collectors and touched unclean lepers. This is not the Messiah they were praying for. This man has no chance to take out the Roman Empire and put us back into power. And Pilate gives them a choice. This Jewish council, the Sanhedrin, Caiaphas, and all the high priests are given this choice then as Jesus is dressed in a purple robe and a crown of thorns, essentially being paraded out as a comedic relief. We can release him because he is no threat to me, says Pilate, or we can release Barabbas. What do you choose? I think that's a real Marie Kondo moment, right? Like, which one of these gives you joy? Like, 3 of you know who Marie Kondo is. It's all right. Well, you can go Netflix it later. And the Jewish council says, free Barabbas. Because Barabbas at least tried to do something. He was guilty of being an insurrectionist and leading a rebellion against the Roman Empire. Barabbas at least did something that they understood with force to try and bring them back to prominence. He may not be the Messiah we prayed for, but at least he's fighting. And this man is weak. And this man says, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. And this man is telling us things that just don't make sense for a king. They cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate asked them, shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, we have no king but the emperor. In some translations it says, we have no king but Caesar. And in a moment and in a line, Caiaphas and the chief priests sold out their entire religion for political power. In one quick moment, our allegiance is not with God. Our allegiance is with the ones that continue to give us money and power. Caesar is Lord. And in that moment, they convince Pilate to hand Jesus over to be crucified. And Caiaphas goes on for a few more years as high priest before he retires and basically lives on a farm in the area. So what do we do with this man called Jesus? Earlier, we talked about this idea that when Pilate came into Rome, he had placed statues of Caesar all around to remind the new occupied territory who was really in charge. This kingdom has come, and here is who you worship. Here is who is leading you. Here is who is in power. And what's interesting, if you ever have a chance to go to different museums where they have some of these statues, I had a chance to visit a few, and they're really, one, it's really impressive because most of them had removable heads because governors and emperors changed enough that they found it easier to just build a head and put it on a different bust. But it's not just a reminder of what they look like. Oh, that's cool, that's what Tiberius and his family looks like. But these were carved kind of as representations of the power that Caesar held to remind the people who was in charge. But Jesus continually talks about this idea of his kingdom, of God's kingdom versus man's. But there's no statue to remind who to worship, who to follow. There is Jesus. And at the very beginning of John's gospel, it starts off with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And a few verses later it says, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among them. We don't have a statue to look at or to follow or some static image of some pious ruler to remind us of who's in charge. We have a God who put on flesh and moved in to our neighborhood, who brings forth this kingdom that is not from this world, but is definitely for this world as that reminder. So that leaves us with just 3 questions today. Are we with Pilate? Do we side with Pilate? Do we identify with Pilate? Are we so easily coerced into making decisions with the crowd shouting outside of it? Are we so insecure and afraid to lose whatever power we have, or just so ambitious that we know what we want to do is the best thing to do, and that power and that money and that station is the aim, so much so that we just push Jesus aside? Or are we with the high priests? Are we with Caiaphas? Do we identify that this life that Jesus is asking us to live is turning things upside down in a way that is uncomfortable, and it is challenging our way of life, it's threatening our wealth, it's threatening our prosperity? Jesus is asking us to love people we want nothing to do with. This is no good. He has to go. Or are we with Jesus, who humbly stands silent amidst this chaos and reminds us how to love deeply into a broken and hurting world? When we leave this place today and we go out from here and have a chance to look in the mirror, these are the questions that I deal with on a daily basis. Where are the areas of my life where I'm Pilate, where I'm holding on to my power and my station and my pride and pushing Jesus aside? Where am I like Caiaphas, where I enjoy the comforts that I have, and even though Jesus sometimes calls me to give them up for his sake, I am not willing to lay them down because this is easy. I understand this. This is comfortable. Or where in my life can I use more Jesus? Where can I understand how to quietly love other people in this crazy and broken world? So as we get ready to wrap up and sing one more song together, we did this last service, and it's always funny because you hear preachers talk about, well, we're going to open up the altars as if they were closed at any point in service, and if you had come down earlier to pray, we would have to kick you out and remove you for breaking the rules and the decorum of this place. These altars are only open for 6 minutes at the end of service. Don't step in before that, okay? But we're going to open the altars. I don't know another way to put that. We're going to make it available, just a chance to come and to pray and a chance to reflect and look inward. Is all of these people, Pilate, the high priests, the Sanhedrin, the Jewish councils, all of them pushed and pushed and pushed Jesus towards crucifixion. Where can we look inwardly and feel like we're doing the same thing? So it's a chance to come down and pray and to ask Jesus to show you those areas of our lives where we need just a little bit more of him. And because we so fully believe in this thing we call community, if somebody comes down to pray and you feel so led, go pray with them. We can't do this thing alone. We need each other desperately. We believe we are a faith family, and if this is your first weekend with us, you're part of the family now, right? If you're here, you're family. That's basically an Italian restaurant slogan. It's all good. So as we get ready to sing this last song, may we be people that push aside those places in our life where we're holding dear to things that Jesus is calling us to let go. May we be people not afraid to dig deep and understand there are places in our life that Jesus needs control of. And may we be people that don't identify with Pilate, the power grab, don't identify with Caiaphas and the idea that life is good as we have it, because there is a Jesus that is calling us to something bigger, better, and greater than we could ever grasp.